dropping temperature, and her hands were trembling, though not entirely from the cold. It wasn't the storm itself that unsettled her. It was the footprints. She had first seen them nearly half an hour ago. Perfectly formed, massive prints that crossed the road ahead of her car and disappeared into the woods. At first, she thought they belonged to a bear, but they were too large. And something about their shape didn't seem right. What kind of animal walks on two legs? Her hands tightened around the steering wheel as she glanced at the rearview mirror. The tracks were still visible in the distance, framed by the snow now piling onto the road. She had driven past them, telling herself it was nothing, that she just needed to focus on reaching her parents' house. But the tracks had followed her. At every turn, every bend in the road, she saw them again, crossing just ahead of her, always fresh, untouched by the storm. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, startling her. She grabbed it, her eyes darting to the screen. No service. The car's engine sputtered, breaking her concentration. No, she muttered, tapping the dashboard as if that would help. The headlights flickered once, and then the car shuddered to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening. She sat frozen in the driver's seat, her breath fogging the windshield as she stared out at the storm. The world felt impossibly still, the kind of stillness that makes your chest tighten, as if the air itself were waiting for something to happen. And then it did. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a dark shape slipping between the trees, quick and deliberate. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough to make her heart lurch. Her headlights flickered again, casting brief, jagged shadows across the snow. That's when she saw it. In the middle of the road, just ahead of her car, was a single figure, tall, motionless, and staring straight at her. Sophia's breath hitched as she stared at the figure through the frost-rimmed windshield. The headlights gave only glimpses of it, the storm swallowing the edges of its form. It didn't move. It just stood there. She fumbled for the door lock, her trembling fingers struggling to engage it. The click of the lock felt like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. Its proportions were off, arms too long, legs bent at an unnatural angle. And its face. Her heart pounded as she realized she couldn't see a face at all. Just a blank, pale void where features should have been. The car's heater sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into icy silence. Her breath fogged the glass as panic clawed at her chest. She glanced down at her phone again, still no service. When she looked back up, the figure was gone. The road ahead was empty, the snow falling heavier now, erasing any trace that had ever been there. Sophia scanned the edges of the forest, her eyes darting to every shadow between the trees. And then she heard it, a faint tapping. It came from behind her. She froze, the sound growing louder, more insistent, like fingernails drumming against glass. It was coming from the rear window. Sophia's hands gripped the steering wheel as if it could shield her. Slowly, painfully slowly, she turned her head. The back window was fogged over from the cold, the snow outside blurring everything beyond it. But there was something there, a dark shape, pressed against the glass. Her stomach twisted as she realized it wasn't just pressing, it was breathing. The fog on the window pulsed in time with the faint sound of exhalation, each breath sending chills racing down her spine. She slammed her hand onto the ignition, twisting the key frantically. The engine coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life. The tapping stopped. Without hesitating, she threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning uselessly on the icy road before catching. The car jerked backward, and she turned the wheel sharply, trying to maneuver out of the spot. Her headlights swung wildly across the trees, and for a moment, she saw it again. The figure was standing just inside the tree line, its head tilted at the same unsettling angle. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them. 5, maybe 6 figures, identical in their eerie stillness, their faceless heads all turned toward her. Sophia's foot slammed on the gas. The car fishtailed, skidding dangerously close to the edge of the road before straightening. She didn't care where she was going anymore. She just needed to get away. The road blurred as she sped through the storm, her knuckles white on the wheel. But no matter how far she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were following her. The blizzard swallowed the road ahead, leaving Sophia driving blind. Her eyes flicked constantly between the windshield and the rearview mirror, her heart pounding with every passing second. The car slid slightly on the icy surface, but she managed to keep it steady. She glanced at the mirror again. There was nothing. No figures. No shapes moving between the trees. Just the swirling snow and the faint, distorted glow of her taillights reflecting off the storm. Her breath came in shallow bursts, fogging the inside of the car. "It's fine," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "They're gone. Whatever they were, they're gone." She tried to believe it, to focus on the road and the faint hope of reaching her parents' house. But deep down, she knew better. The heater was still dead, and the cabin of the car was growing colder by the second. Sophia pulled her coat tighter around herself, her hands shaking, not just from the chill. She had to think. If she could just find a gas station, a diner, anything, she could stop and get help. Her eyes scanned the roadside, hoping for a sign, but all she saw was an endless stretch of white. And then the car shuddered violently. It felt like she had hit something, the impact throwing her forward against the seatbelt. The steering wheel jerked in her hands, and the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," she cried, slamming her foot on the brake. The car skidded to a halt, and she sat frozen, gripping the wheel as she tried to calm her racing heart. She looked back through the rearview mirror, her stomach churning. Had she hit an animal? A person? But there was nothing there. The road behind her was pristine, untouched. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she unbuckled her seatbelt. The logical part of her screamed to stay in the car, to lock the doors and wait until daylight. But something else, a terrible, gnawing curiosity, urged her to check. She grabbed her phone, switching on the flashlight, and slowly stepped out into the storm. The cold hit her like a slap, cutting through her coat and biting at her skin. The snow swirled around her in a chaotic frenzy, but she forced herself to move. The rear of the car was undamaged. The snow beneath the tires showed no sign of an impact. Her stomach twisted as she realized what she had hit. The front of the car told a different story. A dark, wet smear stretched across the hood, dripping down onto the ground below. She stepped closer, her breath hitching as the light from her phone caught something on the bumper. A single, bloodied handprint. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she staggered back, her flashlight darting to the snow around her. The handprint wasn't alone. There were footprints now leading away from the car and into the trees. They were massive and human, and they were fresh. A low growl rumbled from the darkness beyond the tree line. Sophia's legs refused to move as her flashlight trembled in her hand. She swept the beam of light across the trees, desperate to see what was there. Two hollow, glowing eyes stared back at her from the shadows. And then it lunged. Sophia didn't think, she acted. Her legs moved before her mind caught up, carrying her back toward the car as the creature erupted from the shadows. It was massive, its pale, elongated body writhing unnaturally, its hollow eyes locked onto her. She reached the car door and yanked it open, throwing herself inside just as a deafening thud shook the vehicle. The creature's clawed hands slammed against the window, the glass spiderwebbing under the force. Its face, or what passed for one, pressed against the crackling glass, teeth bared in a twisted, inhuman grin. Sophia fumbled for the ignition, her fingers numb and trembling. The engine sputtered, threatening to stall. Come on, she screamed, slamming her hand on the dashboard. The creature dragged its claws across the windshield, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. It circled the car with terrifying speed, its movements jerky, as though it didn't quite belong in this world. Finally, the engine roared to life. Sophia slammed the car into gear and floored the gas. The tires spun on the ice before catching, and the car lurched forward. The creature didn't chase, it leapt. Its massive form landed on the roof with a metallic clang, the weight threatening to tip the car. Sophia screamed as the roof began to cave inward, the creature's claws punching through the metal. The car skidded wildly, veering toward the edge of the road. "Not like this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She jerked the wheel, the car careening dangerously close to the edge of a steep embankment. With a desperate cry, she hit the brakes, sending the car spinning out of control. The creature was thrown from the roof, its body vanishing into the darkness below as the car came to a shuddering halt just inches from the edge. Silence. Sophia sat motionless, her chest heaving as she gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. The only sound was the howling wind outside. It was gone. She dared to look around, her eyes scanning the storm for any sign of movement. Nothing. The road was empty, the forest still. Her breath hitched as she tried to process what had just happened. She reached for her phone, her fingers brushing against the flashlight. The beam flickered on, illuminating the snow outside. And then she saw them. The footprints. They were everywhere, surrounding the car, leading back into the trees, crisscrossing the road ahead, as if there had never been just one. Sophia's scream was swallowed by the storm as the car's engine sputtered and died once more. When the search party found her car 2 days later, it was empty. The driver's side door was open, and the snow inside was undisturbed. No footprints led away from the scene. The only evidence left behind was a single bloodied handprint on the hood, frozen solid in the icy air. No one ever saw Sophia again. It started with the snow angels. Nate loved winter. He loved the crunch of fresh snow under his boots, the crisp bite of cold air on his cheeks, and the way the world seemed quieter, more peaceful, under a blanket of white. That's why he'd insisted on bringing his 2 closest friends, Mia and Jordan, to a remote cabin in the woods for the weekend. "It's going to be perfect," he had said, his excitement contagious. Snow, hot chocolate, a cozy fire, no distractions. And at first it was. The 3 of them spent their first day sledding, building snowmen, and making snow angels in the wide, open field behind the cabin. They laughed until their stomachs hurt, their childish games a welcome escape from the stress of everyday life. But the next morning, everything changed. Nate woke early, before the others, and stepped outside to take in the stillness of the snow-covered landscape. He smiled, pulling his jacket tighter around him as his breath billowed out in clouds. Then he saw them. The snow angels they had made the day before were still there, their crisp outlines etched into the snow. But there were more now. Dozens more. They stretched across the field in neat rows, perfectly spaced, as if some unseen hand had carefully arranged them in the middle of the night. Nate frowned, a chill creeping up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Mia?" "Jordan," he called, his voice breaking the eerie silence. No answer. The cabin was dark and still behind him, his friends still asleep inside. He stepped closer to the nearest angel, his boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. It was identical to the ones they had made the day before, the same sweeping wings, the same faint imprint of a head and arms. But the longer he stared, the more wrong it felt. The arms seemed longer than they should have been, the wings sharper, like jagged icicles. And the head? Nate froze, his stomach lurching. The head wasn't round like it had been the day before. It was stretched, elongated, with deep grooves that looked disturbingly like the ridges of a face. Nate took a step back, his boots sinking into the snow. His breath came faster, visible puffs of panic against the icy morning air. He scanned the field again, his heart pounding as the rows of snow angels seemed to stretch further than before. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate, and the sight of them made his skin crawl. He turned back toward the cabin, desperate to wake the others. Inside, the warmth of the fire greeted him, but it felt hollow, as though the cold from outside had seeped into the walls. "Mia." "Jordan," he shouted, his voice echoing through the small space. Jordan appeared first, bleary-eyed and yawning. "Dude, what's your deal? It's barely light out." Nate grabbed him by the arm and dragged him toward the window. "You need to see this. Now." Mia stumbled into the room moments later, wrapped in a blanket. "What's going on?" "Look outside," Nate said, his voice trembling. The three of them stood by the frosted window, staring out at the field.
Mia gasped.
Jordan's face paled. What the hell?"
Mia whispered.
Jordan shook his head. "No way. No one else is out here. We'd hear them." "That's what I'm saying," Nate replied, his voice rising. "Those weren't there yesterday. I checked before we went to bed." For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, staring at the rows of snow angels. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the field. The angels looked even stranger in the dim morning light, their distorted forms almost lifelike. Jordan finally broke the silence. "Maybe it's just some freak weather thing," he said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. "Freak weather doesn't carve faces into the snow," Nate shot back. Mia hugged the blanket tighter around herself. "We need to call someone. The Rangers, maybe?" Nate pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. He stared at the screen. No signal. "Of course," he muttered bitterly. Jordan sighed and rubbed his face. "Okay, let's go out there. Get a closer look. It's probably nothing." "Nothing," Nate said, his voice incredulous. "Did you look at them? Something made those." Jordan grabbed a flashlight from the counter and shrugged on his coat.
"Exactly.
Something. And we won't know what unless we check." Mia hesitated, then nodded reluctantly.
"Fine.
"But we stick together. No splitting up." The three of them ventured outside, the cabin door creaking loudly in the still morning air. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they approached the field, the cold biting at their exposed skin. Up close, the snow angels were even more unsettling. The elongated heads had hollow depressions where eyes should have been, and faint grooves hinted at twisted, jagged smiles. Mia gagged, covering her mouth. "This isn't right. This isn't." Her words cut off as a low, keening sound echoed across the field. The three of them froze. The sound was faint at first, like wind whistling through a hollow tunnel. But it grew louder, more distinct. It was a wailing, mournful cry that seemed to come from all around them. Nate turned in a circle, his eyes darting to the trees at the edge of the field. "Do you hear that?" "Of course I hear it," Jordan snapped, his grip tightening on the flashlight. Then the angels started to change. Nate watched in horror as the snow around one of the figures began to shift, collapsing inward as though being pulled into itself. The face grew more defined, the ridges deepening into sharp angles. The wings flared, rising slightly from the ground. The snow angel moved. Mia screamed, stumbling back as the snow angel twisted unnaturally, its form breaking free from the ground. The sound of snow crunching and grinding filled the air as the figure rose, its jagged wings spreading wide. Nate felt his blood turn to ice. "Run," he shouted, grabbing Mia's arm and yanking her toward the cabin. Jordan stood frozen, his flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the grotesque, shifting figure. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The angel's face turned toward him, its hollow eyes locking onto his. The ridges of its mouth twisted into a ghastly grin, and it took a lurching step forward. "Jordan, move," Nate shouted, his voice cutting through the wailing cries that still echoed across the field. Jordan snapped out of his daze and turned to run, but it was too late. The angel lunged with an unnatural speed, its jagged wings slicing through the air. Nate and Mia reached the cabin just in time to hear Jordan's scream pierce the storm. Nate turned back, his hand on the doorframe, and saw Jordan collapse into the snow. The angel loomed over him, its arms reaching down, wrapping around his body like icy tendrils.
"No."
Nate shouted, but Mia pulled him inside, slamming the door shut. "We can't help him," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Nate pounded his fist against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cabin walls creaked under the weight of the cold, and the wailing outside grew louder, more chaotic. He looked at Mia, his mind racing. "We have to figure out what's going on," he said. Mia shook her head. "We need to barricade the door. We need to." Before she could finish, The window beside her shattered. A jagged shard of ice shot through the glass, embedding itself in the wall. The cold outside seemed to rush in all at once, chilling the air to a suffocating degree. Mia screamed, stumbling back, and Nate grabbed a chair, shoving it under the doorknob. "What are we going to do?" she sobbed. Nate didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the window, where the remaining snow angels now moved, their forms gliding across the field. Their jagged wings shimmered in the faint light, and their hollow eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural, icy luminescence. One by one, they turned toward the cabin. Nate swallowed hard. "The fire," he said suddenly, his voice breaking through the panic. "We need to keep the fire going." "What?" Mia asked, her voice trembling.
Heat.
"They're made of snow, right? If we can make the cabin hot enough," he trailed off, his mind grasping at anything that felt like hope. Mia nodded, her face pale but determined. "I'll grab more wood." She bolted toward the small pile of firewood by the hearth, while Nate fumbled with a box of matches, lighting the gas burner on the stove. Every second felt like an eternity as the wailing outside grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic crunch of snow. They were getting closer. Mia tossed another log onto the fire, the flames roaring to life. The cabin grew warmer, the frost melting from the edges of the broken window. For a moment, it seemed to work. The wailing subsided, and the shapes outside slowed, their movements becoming sluggish. But then the front door groaned. Nate's stomach dropped as he turned to see the wood splintering under an unseen force. The chair he'd wedged under the knob began to slide, and a jagged claw pierced through the center of the door. "They're getting in," Mia cried, backing away from the door. Nate grabbed the poker from the fireplace, the metal searing his hand as he held it tightly. "We're not going down without a fight." The door burst open, the icy wind howling into the cabin as the first angel stepped inside. The angel towered in the doorway, its jagged form glowing faintly in the flickering firelight. The cold it radiated was suffocating, and the air inside the cabin felt brittle, as if even the heat couldn't hold it together. Nate gripped the poker tightly, his knuckles white. His breath clouded in front of him as he stepped forward. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice trembled. The angel tilted its head, that grotesque grin spreading wider. Behind it, more figures emerged, their hollow eyes fixated on the two of them. Mia screamed as another angel pressed against the shattered window, its clawed hand reaching inside. "They're everywhere," she cried, stumbling backward toward the fireplace. Nate swung the poker at the angel in the doorway, the glowing metal slicing through its icy wing. The creature recoiled, emitting a bone-chilling screech that rattled the windows. But as Nate stepped forward, triumphant, the severed wing began to reform, the snow pulling itself back together. "Oh, come on," he yelled in frustration. Mia grabbed a burning log from the fireplace, the flames licking at her hands as she hurled it toward the angel by the window. The creature jerked back, its hollow eyes narrowing as the fire consumed part of its arm. "It's working," she shouted. Nate didn't need to be told twice. He lunged for another burning log, his mind racing. Keep the fire alive. They fought with everything they had, the glowing embers of the fire their only weapon against the advancing figures. Every swing, every desperate toss of flames sent the angels screeching back, but the creatures didn't stop. They kept coming, their jagged wings slicing through the air, their hollow eyes unrelenting. The firewood was running low. The cabin walls groaned, the frost spreading across the beams and floorboards. The angels pressed closer, their cold seeping into every corner of the room. Mia's hand trembled as she tossed the last log into the fireplace. The flames roared once more, the heat momentarily driving the creatures back. But then the fire sputtered. The heat waned, and the angels moved in. Nate grabbed Mia, pulling her close as the creatures surrounded them. Their twisted forms loomed over the dying fire, their hollow eyes glowing brighter. Mia clutched his arm. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Nate stared into the flames, their light reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. "I don't." The fire went out. Darkness swallowed the cabin, and the last thing either of them felt was the bone-chilling cold as the angels closed in. When the Rangers reached the cabin 3 days later, they found it eerily untouched. The door hung open, but there was no sign of struggle, no broken furniture, no blood, nothing. Just rows upon rows of snow angels, perfectly formed in the field. And in the center of the largest one, 2 faint impressions, the outline of a man and a woman, their arms reaching for each other. The knock came just after midnight. Emma jolted awake, her heart pounding as the sound echoed through the small, remote cabin. She blinked, disoriented, as the wind howled outside, shaking the windows. The snowstorm had rolled in hours ago, blanketing the forest in white and cutting her off from the rest of the world. Another knock.
Slow.
Deliberate. Emma sat up, pulling the blankets tighter around her. She had rented the cabin for solitude, a chance to disconnect and clear her head after a chaotic year. No phone, no neighbors, no distractions, just her, the woods, and the snow. But now, someone was outside. Her breath clouded in the frigid air as she swung her legs off the bed. The fireplace had gone out, leaving the cabin cold and dark. She shivered, glancing toward the front door. It was a heavy, reinforced slab of wood, but the thought of it being the only thing between her and whoever, or whatever, was knocking made her uneasy. Knock. Knock. The sound was louder this time, more insistent. Emma grabbed the flashlight from her bedside table and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, trembling slightly in her hand as she made her way toward the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She reached the door and hesitated, her fingers hovering over the deadbolt. Through the frosted window beside the door, she could make out a vague figure standing just beyond the porch light's reach. "I can't help you," she said, her voice firmer this time. "There's a storm. Try the main lodge." The figure didn't move. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, the beam casting jittery shadows as she leaned closer to the window. The figure was tall and thin, its shoulders hunched against the wind. It wore what looked like an old, tattered coat, the edges crusted with frost. Another knock, but this time it wasn't on the door. It came from the window. Emma stumbled back, her heart racing as she swung the flashlight toward the sound. The frosted glass rippled faintly, as though someone or something was breathing against it. "Please," a voice rasped, muffled by the storm. Emma froze. The voice was low and hoarse, barely audible over the howling wind. It sounded human but wrong, somehow. Against every instinct, she stepped closer to the window. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. The figure shifted, its head tilting slightly. "It's so cold. Let me in." Her stomach churned. Something about the way it spoke sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't desperate. It was expectant. The flashlight flickered in her hand, and for the briefest moment, the beam of light caught the figure's face. Or what should have been a face. The figure's face, or the lack of it, sent a wave of cold terror through Emma. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, frost-bitten skin stretched too tightly across an angular skull. The flashlight's beam caught faint cracks in the icy surface, the pale flesh shimmering like frozen glass. Emma stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. "What the hell?" she whispered, unable to finish the thought. The figure tilted its head, as if hearing her words despite the storm. Then it took a step closer to the window. The voice came again, low and guttural, dripping with something ancient and malevolent. "Let me in." "No," she said, louder this time, forcing herself to back away. Her shaking hand fumbled with the deadbolt, making sure the door was locked. "You need to leave. Now." The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, the wind whipping around it, its frostbitten form unmoving. Then, slowly, it raised one hand. The fingers were long, bony, and tipped with jagged, ice-like claws. It pressed the hand against the window pane, and Emma watched in horror as the frost on the glass began to spread outward, spiderwebbing across the surface. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was snowed in, miles from anyone, and the storm outside would swallow her whole. The cabin groaned as the cold seeped in, the temperature plummeting. Emma's breath came in sharp clouds, her fingers numb as she clutched the flashlight. The voice came again, louder, angrier.
Let me in.
The window cracked. Emma turned and bolted for the fireplace. Her hands fumbled with the matches, her mind racing. If she could relight the fire, maybe the heat would buy her some time. Another crack rang out, this time from the front door. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she struck match after match, her trembling fingers struggling to hold steady. Finally, the kindling caught, and flames roared to life, casting flickering light across the cabin. The warmth was faint but immediate, and the frost on the windows stopped spreading. Emma grabbed the poker from the hearth and turned toward the door, her back pressed against the fireplace. She could hear it now, a slow, deliberate scraping against the wood. The figure was still outside. She tightened her grip on the poker, her mind racing. Whatever it was, it hadn't broken in yet. Maybe it couldn't. Maybe the cabin was somehow keeping it out. But then the voice came again, this time from everywhere and nowhere at once. You can't keep me out forever. Emma's blood ran cold. The cabin lights flickered, and the flames in the fireplace guttered. The frost began to creep across the windows again, faster this time, and the air grew so cold it hurt to breathe. A deafening bang echoed through the cabin as the door shook violently. The hinges groaned under the strain, and Emma knew it wouldn't hold much longer. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Leave me alone," she screamed. The banging stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then a whisper, soft and mocking. "You invited me." Emma's eyes widened in horror. "I didn't," but the truth hit her like a punch to the gut. She had spoken to it. She had responded. And in doing so, she had let it in. The door splintered, and the frost-covered figure stepped inside. The figure loomed in the doorway, its jagged form casting long, distorted shadows across the cabin walls. Frost spread outward from its feet, creeping over the floorboards in thin, crackling tendrils. Emma clutched the fireplace poker like a lifeline, her breath shallow and fast. The flames behind her sputtered, their warmth barely holding the freezing cold at bay. You can't be here," she stammered, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. "I am here," it rasped, its voice a guttural echo that seemed to vibrate through the cabin. Emma stepped back, her mind racing for a plan. "Stay away," she screamed, swinging the poker in front of her. The metal glowed faintly from the heat of the fire, a desperate line of defense against the encroaching figure. It stopped, its hollow, eyeless gaze fixed on her. The frost spreading beneath it slowed, almost as if it were waiting. For what? The thought sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through her. "Why me?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure took a step closer, the sound of its movement like ice splintering underfoot. "You opened the door," it said. "I didn't. You spoke my name." The memory struck her like a bolt of lightning. Hours ago, she had read a passage in the old journal she'd found tucked into a drawer in the cabin's bedroom. The handwriting had been shaky, the ink smeared, but one line stood out. "Do not speak to the frozen one. To name it is to invite it in." She had laughed nervously at the time, brushing it off as a ghost story from whoever had stayed in the cabin before her. But then she'd read the name out loud, her curiosity getting the better of her. And now it was here. Emma's grip on the poker tightened, her knuckles turning white. "What do you want?" The figure's grin widened, the cracks in its face spreading. "To take you." The frost on the floor surged forward, wrapping around her boots and pinning her in place. She screamed, swinging the poker wildly, but the metal only hissed against the frost, melting it for a moment before it reformed stronger than before. The figure was inches away now, its freezing breath misting the air around her. The light from the fire caught the icy ridges of its face, making it look even more grotesque. Emma's mind raced. The fire, it was her only chance. With a desperate cry, she hurled the glowing poker at the figure. The metal struck its chest, and for a moment, the cabin was filled with a deafening screech. The creature recoiled, frost peeling away from its form as the fire's heat burned through it. Emma yanked her boots free from the melting frost and lunged toward the fireplace. Grabbing a burning log with her bare hands, she turned and thrust it toward the creature. The flames roared as they connected, engulfing the figure in a blinding burst of light and heat. The cabin shook, the frost on the walls and windows retreating in an instant. The figure's scream pierced the air, a sound so otherworldly it made her ears ring. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The cabin was silent. Emma collapsed to the floor, the burning log still clutched in her trembling hands. The figure was gone, nothing but a puddle of melting frost left behind. She sat there for what felt like hours, the fire crackling softly behind her, the warmth slowly returning to the room. But as the storm outside began to calm, her relief turned to dread. On the frost-covered window, written in jagged, icy letters, were 3 words: "I'll be back."